All right, good morning, all. I'm gonna. I know we're kind of crunched for time, so I can't really. I just want to share a few thoughts around trying to lay a little bit of a groundwork around sort of a theological perspective on what we're talking about here. And obviously, we could spend a whole course on this, but I think most of us probably are familiar with the things that I'm going to name, but I just want to name them so that we can have a little bit of a backdrop biblically and theologically for this conversation. So first of all, I think some of this is just out of my own journey and the things that I've picked up along the way that are kind of, I'm realizing the strong impact of culture on this conversation. And that's not, that would be consistent with what's in the scripture. I mean, what you find in scripture is, I think God, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, is kind of giving us hints all along the way about the way that God sees women. And culturally, I think the pressure is so strong, the cultural pressure is so strong that folks didn't pick it up all the time. And then I think that sort of way of seeing, as it is in most all the things that we're doing, some of this stuff isn't quite so obvious to us because culturally we're sort of blind to it. Just quickly in the creation narrative, I think, like right out the gate, there are things that hint at God's design for male and female, for all people to sort of be experienced in relationship. Some of the ways that we were culturally, I'll say, sort of blinded to that was word choices in the language, in the way that we've come to read and understand, even in the very beginning the creation narrative. Adam's name really isn't Adam as if it's a man. It's really pointing to Adam as humanity. And so along the way, we've made these choices about what that kind of means. And if you look at Genesis 2, even the word choices for male and female, they're the same. They come out of the same root word, ish and isha, which really is the same root word, not one over the other, which is sort of, again, language choices that culturally we've made that have kind of skewed how we then understand God moving in creation. And so I think for me personally with that, I mean, I learned this. My first class in seminary was a creation class. And I remember sitting there going, are you kidding me? I think there've been so many, like countless times when I've sat and learned things about language choices that have actually, cultivated and perpetuated things like patriarchy in our work. And that was one of them. And so moving from many stories in the Old Testament to the New Testament and the ministry of Christ, we know this, right? There are many women in the Gospels that Jesus lifts up. In all four of the Gospels, it was women who actually declared Jesus Messiah. And, we're moving into Easter here and the resurrection. Again, why aren't we talking about that? These are choices that we're making when we preach. We kind of do damage to the story when we don't lift up the things that are there for us to see because of cultural sort of biases. And honestly, as a woman, I lean into those, but it's been interesting to kind of reflect on the absence of women in the story from the pulpit. Paul, in the letters, there are 13 women that Paul mentions. 13 women in the letters. And when Paul refers to these women, and I won't go through all of them and name them, but they're kind of brief mentions. But as we all know, when folks are mentioned and their names are mentioned, that's something to pay attention to. And each time these women's names are mentioned, they are mentioned in the same context and referred to in the same context as when Paul mentions men, servants, help with the gospel, all the similar ways that men have been mentioned, but yet we don't kind of lift those names up very well in the way that we, understand the importance of women's names, the women who were involved both in the early church and leadership of the early church. There were women church planters. I don't think I've actually even, I run into a lot of church planters, not met any women. So, I sit here and I wonder, why? And, for the women that are on this call, I know that when we go into spaces, especially Christian spaces, especially church spaces, these are the things that we, those are the questions that kind of are at the forefront, at least in my mind. Last thing that I'll say, just in terms of, setting all this up, as it relates to street songs, in particular, I just feel like theologically, just if the image of God is fullest with a diverse expression of the people of God, then I think it behooves us to sort of, this question of who's not at the table, which is a question that I think we are trained to ask as community development people, who's not here. And so I think that, to take some honest, hard looks at, who is not here presently in terms of the female part of the image of God, then we need to ask the questions why. And I know this group particularly leans into theological stuff. And I just want to say that it's all there for us. It's there for the taking. It's there for us to sort of wrestle with just as much as we wrestle with anything else when we talk about other parts of, from below. And of course, biblically and culturally, women were those people. And I find great encouragement and hope and courage and a little bit of conviction when I'm thinking about that question on behalf of our group. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sure that all the things that I've just said are things that we all already know. I'm not going to sit up here and pretend like I'm the expert on this, because I think we all are people who love the scriptures and want to dig in and kind of, chew it up. And so just this was intended to be kind of a reminder for us as we move forward in this conversation, and would love to, in the calls to come, chew that up a little bit more with all of you. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm grateful that, Rebecca, that we've met you, and I'm not going to say anymore. I'm going to just hand it over to you to sort of lead the way. I think the way that we're going to do this is, I know Rebecca has created some space for us to ask questions, and hopefully we can let her get through as much as she can, and then we have some time at the end to have some conversations about how some of this pertains to the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Lena.
Yep.
Well, I'll start by just giving a little bit of my intro. Chris gave a little bit of it, but it'll give you some context about the perspective that I'm coming from this at. And it's a very different perspective than what you all will be bringing to the table here. And I will count on all of you to kind of help bring this around, because this is going to be from a little bit more of a secular cultural perspective, kind of the science behind how our brains work, to help with the understanding of what Lena was talking about, of how we are bringing this cultural view to our decisions that we make. So I ask that you all kind of think about that, be open-minded that this is a different perspective, and think about how it relates to the decisions that you're making every day. So I come from a consulting background. So I started out of school. Actually, I went to Gonzaga University for the college basketball fans. So they're doing good. I'm excited. One more game that hopefully we can make it through one at a time, right? Which is a Catholic Jesuit school, for those of you who don't know, on the eastern side of Washington. So although I don't come from a strong religious background, I've been around it all my life and feel very close to close to the Catholic religion and love your mission, right? I feel very humbled to be able to present to you all, even from my kind of diverse perspective as we're talking about this. So I came into consulting and did that for many years for a big consulting firm, Deloitte and Touche, which is a global company. I did work doing change management and culture change with large organizations. And then at the end of my career there, I had transitioned to doing mergers and acquisitions work. So, large financial takeovers of companies, and it really got me jaded. So I left that and went out on my own to do strategic planning for organizations like yours. So there were nonprofits that I worked with to help them think about, they were transitioning from small operating budgets to larger operating budgets, and what does that look like, and where do they want to go, what's their plan for the future. And so it helped me get into more of a mission-driven space. And for about the last 5 years, I've been working with a lot of different types of companies, some nonprofits, a lot of for-profit tech companies in the Bay Area, to work on their diversity strategies. And what that means is there's an education piece, which you're going to get a little glimpse of it today. So normally this intro would take me at least 2 hours. So we're going to go pretty quickly. So that means that what we need to do is really have a conversation. So I'll be going quickly, but please stop me if you need more information on something. We can always have follow-up conversations. I will be available by email, and I'm happy to have more calls as well, but we'll be going pretty quickly. So there's this education piece of what I do. And then the next piece is what you all are going to start doing from this. Once you have a solid base of the education on how our brains work, in your case of how it mixes with the theology, what are you going to do about it? What are the next steps? So it's one thing to say, yes, we all have these unconscious biases. It's society. It's the way our brains work. That's it. There's nothing we can do. Let's wash our hands of it. So the theory of we're all speeding on the highway, so it's just fine. That's not what we want to accomplish from this. What we want to accomplish is, now that we know what these barriers are, we know what might be inhibiting our success, what can we do to stop it? What can we do? What changes can we make? What processes can we put in place? And in your case, to get more women in the mix, right? So you have great diversity in a lot of other dimensions. So how do you change that mix? And first, let's understand what those roadblocks are, because it's hard to find correct strategies when you're just trying to boil the ocean, right? Let's think about what could be some of the things that you recognize and what I go through that could help you. So let's see if we can continue technology. So can you still see my screen? Do you see my bio? Okay, I think I see heads nodding. Oh, it looks like somebody was trying out our presentation tools. We have some red marks. I don't quite know how to get rid of them, so we'll have to just leave them for now. We'll just keep on moving. It's the cool. This is one thing I've been trying to learn about Zoom, right? You can, every participant can get on, and so I need to figure out how to make this interactive. So some of the times I'll do some discussions and call out to all of you, but in the future, I might be able to have everybody right on the screen, which would be very cool. So one of the things that we talk about when we think of diversity, all the different dimensions of diversity, is one of the benefits is that it creates better solutions. So sometimes people are like, oh, does it really? What they have done is, there's this author named Scott Page. He's a PhD, and I think he works in Columbia. He's been around at different schools. So he wrote this book called The Difference, and it is, if anybody's mathematically inclined, it actually goes through a mathematical proof that shows that diversity creates innovation and new ideas. So if you think about people coming from different perspectives, what that adds, what that can give to an environment. And in your case, when I'm talking to tech companies, right, it's coming up with the next great app, right, for phones, or some new technology. For you all, it's making a difference in the world. It's creating communities that can succeed and thrive and grow. And so I really like this connection and the perspective that you need innovation, right, to make a difference in the world. So the theory that Scott Page came up with says that, yes, you have you have more success, you have more ideas, you're able to create better ideas. What this last part says, though, is a diversity of a group also has a negative here. There's a subtraction here, and that is because it is hard to work in diverse groups, which out of everyone, I think this group probably knows that more than others, right? It's hard to work with people who think differently than you. And especially when you're coming from a religious perspective, you know, if you're talking about any religion, there's a diverse set of perspectives in that religion, from conservative to more liberal of those views. So thinking about that, yes, you get better ideas, but you have to be able to deal with the conflict that comes with different perspectives. So yes, let's create a great mix of people, but let's also make sure that while we're creating that mix of people, we're also considering the fact that we need to create a culture in the group that can handle those diverse perspectives. So when you're starting to think about what you do, really think about, in our group that we're trying to diversify, can we listen to diverse perspectives? Is it going to be comfortable for people who are different, for more women? Or is it going to feel uncomfortable for them? Are they going to share their ideas? Because if they can't, you're losing the benefits of having diversity. This is a more recent study by Dr. Catherine Phillips, and she is an amazing woman. I got the privilege to hear her speak, and I might have heard her speak right before I met you on the airplane, Chris. I'm not sure. And so she had me very, very excited and motivated. And her research showed that when you have a diverse group of people, oh, I don't know what's happening. Can you guys still see my screen? Screen sharing has stopped. Oh, okay. Sorry, everyone. Let's see if we can get it back. Well, okay. Just for the interest of time, I'm going to share just this instead of...
If you need some help, I'm here for you.
Can you see my screen now? It's not as pretty as it was before, but okay. We're just going to go with that in the interest of time. As long as you all can see it properly, we are not going to be nitpicky on the technology. So, but what her research shows is that when you get diverse people together, everyone, even the majority group, comes with better ideas. They come with a perspective of, I need to think about my own ideas in a more critical way. I need to listen to other people's ideas to see what the differences are, what are the similarities, and they come out with overwhelmingly more successful results. The interesting part of her study was that although they're much more successful in the end result, so she gives them a problem to solve, and they come up overwhelmingly with the right answer. But if you ask them if they have the right answer, they overwhelmingly say they're not sure, because it was hard to get there. It was difficult. But the groups that are homogeneous groups, they think, oh yeah, I got the right answer. We're good. It was so much fun. We want to go get a cup of coffee after this. It was wonderful. And they very often do not have the right answer, but it felt great getting to the wrong answer. Right. So I love her research because it really puts this into action, right? It puts into action that we're all smarter when we get a diverse group of people. So I get a lot of pushback sometimes from the majority groups at tech companies saying, this is hard. It doesn't feel good. You know, why is this good for me? Not to be selfish. I've heard that before. Not to be selfish, but what does this do for me? What does it do for you? You become smarter, which is a great benefit. So that was the business case. And there's a lot more statistics about how it helps sales organizations or how it helps research. But I pulled out the ones on innovation for this group because I think it's what best applies to what you're doing in your work at StreetSoms. But if anybody is curious about some of those other stats about how most of them are for for-profit companies, right? But it's about how boards that are diverse have more successful results. There's pretty much anything you can think of now that's been studied. There's results to say that diversity is powerful. The rest of the discussion is going to be around understanding this concept that's been in the media, it's been all over the place, about unconscious bias. What is it? What does it mean? And then once we kind of understand that a little bit, have a small introduction to it, what tools can we use to disrupt it, right? We don't want to just say, wonderful, we have it. We want to say, what can we do to stop it? What can we do to disrupt it? And what sort of actions can we take to make change here? So this conversation is not always comfortable. It shouldn't be comfortable. It's not a topic that people like to take head on. So I'd like to ask that we all come to this conversation, and I would hope that it is a conversation. I know I'm going to be talking a lot, so we'll just say that, but I still want you all to interrupt whenever you want. And I will be looking to you all for some input as well of where this makes the most sense for you. But come to this conversation really with an open mind and knowing that this is uncomfortable, but that we have to be uncomfortable to get to a place of growth. So to give a little bit of an introduction, and I started this a little bit earlier when I was talking, that diversity I think of as the mix of people. Who do we have in the room? Do we have different genders? Do we have different viewpoints, backgrounds, socioeconomic? Do we have different lifestyles? Then on the other hand, we have how those people work together. So we have the mix of people on one side, and then how do they actually collaborate and work together? And you have to have both of those. It's almost a yin-yang or a balancing act between those two, because they're equally important in the success of an organization, right? If we think about the Catherine Phillips research, she's talking about how it doesn't feel comfortable always. It's not as easy to work together. That's that inclusion side. And that's why you always hear this D&I. And they're both very distinct and very different. And in our media right now, globally, we hear this D&I, and it's very combined. But really, they're very distinct things. They just are, they hold hands, and they need to be successful. So I'm going to stop just for a minute, and I named a few when I was on the last slide, but what sort of diversity dimensions can you think of? So that is kind of that male, female, right? Man, woman. What sort of diversity dimensions come to mind when you think of this conversation?
Rebecca, are you talking besides the male, female?
Yeah. And I named a few. So I said socioeconomic, and we can move on. We have lots of time, so we don't have much time, so I'll go quickly. And then feel free to jump in if you can think of more. So
Christy, were you going to say something, Christy?
No, they were right there.
Okay.
So the reason I ask that, right, is because a lot of people say these ones that are at the top of this slide, right, at the top of the iceberg, a lot of people say those things that are visible. Right? We say race, ethnicity, we say gender, we say age, how people look, right? That is something that people are very, very aware of all those differences. But if you also think about it, and it's even more applicable for you all, because it's not something visibly you see if you have a different theology, if you have a different religious background. That's not something you outwardly see, and we might make assumptions about that. So all of these things, and obviously there's so many more, are still dimensions of diversity, right? They give a different perspective. So it's not just gender, right? We need to think about all these different aspects to create a culture that's welcoming. Because just because I'm a woman and you want a woman on your team and to diversify it, we also want people who think differently. And what if I'm a woman who also has a lot of other aspects that are different from your group? So it needs to be a culture, and a culture of inclusion that welcomes all of those differences. Any questions on that one? So I'm going to go into the unconscious bias now, and it doesn't work quite as well not in slideshow mode, I just realized, but that's okay. We will make do. So this was a study that some computer scientists decided to develop based on a lawsuit against Walmart that said, oh, your system is biased. There's not women and minorities in your upper level ranks. And the judge found Walmart innocent. Charges were dropped because they said, there's less than 5% bias. That's so minimal. 5% bias. What does that do? So these researchers said, let's see what 5% bias is. What is that? We don't even know what that means. And I doubt the judge did either, right? He didn't know what 5% bias meant. He was trying to think of a number. It's so little. What this computer study showed is that if you have 50% men and 50% women at the bottom level of a tiered organization, so you have many more people at the bottom level, just a few at the top level of the organization, that as you go through the ranks, if you have equal performance ratings, so 1 to 100, you're allowed to give to men and women, and you give them the random sampling. As you go through the organization, by the time you get to the very top, if there's no bias, if randomly 1 to 100 for both men and women, you get to 50% men and 50% women. If you put in 1% bias, and the way they simulate this is by saying men can get 1 to 100 randomly, but women can only get 1 to 99 randomly. If you go through the organization, 7 levels of the organization, by the time you get to the top, women only getting 1 to 99, you have a 30-point difference between men and women at the top. So you have 65% men and 35% women. So if you think about what 5% difference would be, that 5% bias is going to be pretty significant at the very top level of an organization. So if somebody can only get 1 to 95. So now that we looked at the bias has an impact, right? If there's just even a tiny bit of bias for women or whatever majority group or minority group we're looking at, that bias makes an impact in organizations, even ones such as yourselves. But what I want everyone to come away with today is knowing that bias can be blocked. And so this is a wonderful real-life example of bias being blocked. So in 1970, women were only 5% of major US orchestras. And it was even less globally, right? It was a very few, especially if you looked at the major orchestras in Europe, women were even less than 5%. And then there was a lawsuit, and it was in 1970 that required that the US orchestras did blind auditions. So what that means is you had to put a screen up. And by 2014, women represented 37% of the top US orchestras. And even more, they were 50% of the top 200 US orchestras. So what this shows us is with that blind screen, if we take away our ability to say, oh, that's a woman, she's not going to do as good playing the violin, because there were lots of reasons why that women weren't good and weren't in the top orchestras. One of the reasons that was said was, oh, the musculature in the arm of a woman isn't strong enough to do the sounds that we need for the orchestra. So there was lots of reasons, but lo and behold, once you put a screen there, they play just as well. So unfortunately, right, we can't put screens up for all of our work, but what this shows is if we start to think about what mechanisms we can put in place to block our own biases of what women can do, what different ethnicities can do, we can see change, right? So I love that we have a study that actually shows change. We have lots of studies that show that these biases exist, and they are sometimes very depressing, and I'm always staying up on them and reading them all the time, and sometimes it can be disheartening. So I love studies like this that show that we can make change. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the brain, right, and how our brains work. So some of you might have seen this. It's a very popular optical illusion. So the question is, what do you think? Is square A or square B darker? Who thinks, I can't see everybody on my screen, but who thinks A is darker? Raise your hand. And I raise my hand because I think so as well, because it looks darker to me. But lo and behold, even though I've done this 1,000 times now and I look at these slides all the time, I still think A is darker when I'm looking at this slide. When I change it, and let me tell you, I've done squares with what is darker, and nope, they are the same color. But our brains are doing a quick, fast brain calculation. And our fast brain says, it's a checkerboard. It's light, dark pattern. So A is definitely darker. But it's not, it's the same. And it's the shadow. We think that there's a shadow from the cylinder. Lots of things are tricking our brains, but our brains don't have time to analyze this color, right? Just like when a car is speeding towards us and it looks like it's gonna veer towards the sidewalk, do we stop and think and calculate the velocity and how much time we have? Can we get across the street? No, we don't. We just think, okay, I better get out of here, right? You take a step backwards as quick as you can. Does it hit you? No, it doesn't even probably come close to where you were, but you stepped out of the way really quickly. That's your fast brain. Our slow brains might not do that. So what is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias, especially this word bias, gives us an uncomfortable feeling. We don't like that word. But when I use it today, and when you're thinking about it in a research term, really what it means is an error in decision making. We are making a mistake because our brains are working fast. And when we think about unconscious bias in people decisions, right? So when we are making decisions about the competence of another person, especially in a work environment or in an organization such as yours, what we're thinking of, what we call those are implicit stereotypes. And we all know that word stereotype, right? It also is one of those charged words. And it's a charged word for good reason, because stereotypes are usually negative, and we don't have stereotypes usually as strong or negative for our own group, right? We still do hold those stereotypes, but they're not usually as strong. So we see both positive ones, but not as common, and negative ones. So we see Asians have a stereotype of being really good academically, right? I think that's a very common, especially US, right? We think of Asian immigrants as being good at math, good at science, and very academically inclined. And if you think about it, even though that's a positive stereotype, that could have a negative impact if you think about a child or an adult who maybe isn't academically inclined. They're artistically inclined, but there's this stereotype that, they must be good at math. Or we have a child that is struggling in math and science, but teachers aren't giving them the coaching and the tutoring they need because they assume that they are good at these subjects. And there are studies at that as well that show that if something is fitting into a stereotype, such as Asian children, they aren't getting that same focus, right? Is that intentional on the teacher's part? No. But does it affect them going forward? Yes, it does. And the same thing goes for women in leadership and women in math and STEM. So we see women as wonderful communicators. And so actually women are much more likely to get feedback on communication that says, hey, can you work on this, be more of a team leader and communicate more? Maybe you should go into marketing. We push people into the stereotypes that we see. So in the 1980s, researchers discovered that these stereotypes that we have, they used to be able to just ask people. And people would say, oh yeah, I think women belong at home. They should raise children. I think that, Asians should only do math. I don't think that Asians fit into a leadership group. They would just say it, right? They just said their racial biases, right? We know from civil rights that they said for African Americans in this country, people just said those those stereotypes and their opinions on it. In the 1980s, things started to change. They started to ask people questions, and they didn't say that. They said much more compassionate answers and didn't stereotype people. But we didn't see any social changes. So even though people said, I don't see women at home, there wasn't a change in hiring. There wasn't a change in actual behavior. So there was a couple of scientists, Mahzarin Banaji and what's his first name? Greenwald is his last name. They created an implicit association test. And what this test did is kind of eliminate that slow thinking. When you ask somebody, you're able to think about it and think, well, no, I don't think women belong in the home, right? I'll use myself as an example, right? I am a working mother. My mother was a working mother and a computer programmer. I can't hold those biases against women. But lo and behold, if I use my fast brain and I have to associate being home with children, what do I associate it with? I associate it with women. Do I associate science with women? Not as fast. I associate an older man in a white lab coat, maybe slightly balding with some glasses. That's what I see in my head, the picture in my head for a scientist. And so that's my fast brain. So this test, you can actually go to implicit.harvard.edu, and I can send this out later. So I'll send a lot of links and some videos for everyone. But I would recommend you take this test because I took it many years ago, and I continue to take it because I still feel like I must have become more enlightened in the last few years, right? The more I do this, I have to have changed. But what it shows, so it's a computer simulation, and it shows pictures, and you have to either hit one side of your keyboard or the other side of the keyboard depending on which word you associate that picture with. And so you're supposed to go very fast, and if you go too slow, that also, they measure that as well, right? So their algorithm can say how fast and how easy it is for you to associate something. And when I do this, I find that if I take the science and liberal arts and gender one, I definitely associate women with liberal arts and men with science and math. And that's very, very frustrating for me. But it's good and enlightening to know that it doesn't matter what our walks of life, it depends on what cultural norms, as Lena said, right? What are we inundated with? That determines what we associate with. So what I need to do so it doesn't help me. It doesn't help my fast brain to have done all this studying and this research on what happens. That doesn't help me. But what I can draw on, what knowledge I can draw on, is what things I can put in place to make sure my slow brain is working, that I'm really thinking about things and I'm not making these split-second decisions. So as I said before, what does this do, right? How does this impact you in your daily job? What it means is you might be making decisions based on these implicit associations and thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't even ask her if she wants to do this because she has kids. Hey, why shouldn't you ask, right? Is it your decision or hers? Do you associate that person with leadership, or do unconsciously your fast brain say, oh, we need somebody really assertive in this role? And so you don't ask a woman because you don't see her as assertive. So now we're going to go through I'm going to go through pretty quickly on most of these, but there are a lot of resume studies. And these are showing...
Rebecca, before you go on,
yep.
There's a couple of questions in the chat box that I think would be...
wonderful. I can't see them.
Okay, so Joel's from Alaska. Joel, are you on, and do you want to set up your question or your comment there?
Yeah, I mean, I can set it up. So one of the things that was going through my mind as you were setting up some of this is that, at least in the field that I spend most of my time in, which is social services and youth services, the majority of the leaders in Anchorage are female. So most of the time when I'm in those meetings, I don't want to say minority because I did in the question in the box, but that's just, I was trying to sort it out. But I mean, I'm in the minority role in those meetings. You know, and additionally, the church that I serve right now too has all female elders. So I guess my question is, it was more to the group, but what can we learn kind of from environments where women are sort of in the majority of the leaders as we move forward?
I think you're right. So that's definitely something to do, is to think about what were the causes of that, right? What can you replicate? And then I think, so there's two things. One, how can you replicate that, of why and how, talking to these women, right? Of how did you get into the leadership role? What do you think your challenges were? How can we replicate this? So that's one thing. And the other piece is, how does it make you feel, right? Is there a way to make sure that even your experience, you then can take to areas where you are the majority, right? Of like, oh, sometimes it's weird. There's conversations that I don't really get to get in on because they're all about being a mom, or, you know, who knows what, right? And so thinking about that perspective, right? Always putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. But I think that's twofold, right? Definitely knowing what you can replicate, and then also really expanding on your experience that maybe doesn't happen that often, of being the minority.
That's good. And then Ken, I thought your statement was good. It would be a good question for Rebecca to address. Are you there, Ken?
Yeah, Rebecca, you several slides back, you said that bias, it was something like bias is an error in decision making.
Yep.
I was just wondering if you put the word potential, is it always an error, or is it just a potential error in decision making?
So if you're using your fast brain, you're right. It's not always, right? But it's not based on facts. So what you want to do is not rely on your biases, right? So you're right, it could be right sometimes. But what you want to do is not rely on those biases, but rely on facts. So it could be that those facts do prove your bias, but you don't want to rely on that, right? Because that's your fast brain. You want to first go to your slow brain and say, let's really take a look at this and analyze the actual criteria, right? Actually what's happening here, rather than relying on your bias. But you're right, your bias could be right, you know, and biases are based on what we're seeing in our culture, right? We're seeing it on TV, we're seeing it, it's the images that we see. So you're right, it is the potential bias, it's not the potential bias, but the outcome could be the same, right?
Yeah.
Your bias could be proven correct, but because of what your bias relies on, it's not, it's the bias itself is not correct. It's the outcome could be the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if I said that very eloquently.
Well, I had a person, we were talking about this in my church, and one of my elders was just saying, hey, you know, he's trying to point out where bias could be helpful, and how, and just even in the square, the example you gave, like almost all the time when you see the checkerboard, like that's how it works that way. And in driving, you know, we use certain expectations about how other drivers are going to behave, and so that allows us to trust the roads, and so there's sort of a visual perceptive bias that tends to we navigate our days with it. But what I hear you saying is there are times when a lot of times when this just don't work for us, and they're inaccurate, and we need to figure out how to be open to naming them and seeing them.
Exactly. And you bring up a good point, because our fast brains help us survive, right?
Yeah.
So our fast brain is not something we want to eliminate, because that would not be good for our survival as individuals, right? We need to use our fast brain. But do we want to be people that rely on our fast brains when thinking about other human beings, right? So that's where I would say, yes, when we are thinking about cars hitting us on the road, is it okay to step back? Yes. I don't want anybody to think, oh, I should use my slow brain here and calculate how fast this is coming towards me. That is not what this is about, right? This is about thinking specifically in work environments, but I would say for myself, I'd like to do it in my personal environment as well, right? I want to be a type of person that doesn't judge people on what I can see, or the stereotypes that I see in the media that are brainwashing me, right, about different types of people. I want to say, you know what? This woman has been leading organizations for 20 years. She has a group of 50 people that she organizes. She's the leader we need, not having my fast brain say, oh yeah, she's great, but I don't even consider her, right? Not consciously, right? But it's just something you don't even consider. So it's those people related things and how we want to behave as people to each other.
And then, thank you, Rebecca. And then Tim, did you want to make your comment? And then we'll have Rebecca move on.
Yeah, the Black church is highly matriarchal, and it's interesting dynamics when it comes to bias, because depending on what church you're at, the bias could look very different. But generally, it's been reported out that even though the males might have the positional leadership in the majority of African American churches, that the females have the functional leadership. And in a lot of in my church, the pastor's a man, but the women have the power. And so bias looks very, very funny and sometimes obtuse in situations like this. And I think it probably speaks to some structural issues of how we define leadership and who fits into leadership and who doesn't.
I think you're very right. And that happens all over, right? I even see it sometimes when there is a leader of an organization, let's say even, it's a vice president of a company. And you start to analyze things and you see, you know what? Their administrative assistant that makes a tenth of what they make, has no clout, really gets the job done and could be a vice president. Right. And I think it's something similar, right? They don't have the stature, they don't have quite the influence, but they're pretty darn close. Even without all of that, they still are able, they're the ones getting the job done. They're doing all the presentations, they're doing the financial analysis, right? So why wouldn't we raise that person up to make it easier? Because what that probably means is if you could think about what structures are there and what's prohibiting them from moving up. And I'm fully aware that, this is much more complex than saying, we need to change things in an organization that a CEO has control of. But thinking about what small changes could you make that would start to put those women in named positions of power, right? Because would that change? What would that change if they actually had all of the benefits that come with a title, right? Of some that does make a difference.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Was there anything else? These were great comments and great questions.
One of the things that was really helpful to me is the distinction between fast brain and slow brain, and looking at what that means culturally for us in a culture that is absolutely either addicted or in love with speed. So that's a value within the culture, especially Western. And just my comment is within the spiritual life, and I think even AA has a bit of a mantra around this, but it goes something like this, that slow is real when it comes to the spiritual life. And one of the gifts of this conversation is it's very similar to what we do when we do theology from below, which is what we say, we slow the text down. And when we get to a sticky place, the intuition is to speed things up. Or when we get to something that, kind of frustrates us or causes tension, that's whatever it is, and I'm, chief of sinners in this regard, I want to speed it up when things get a little bit sticky. And it's just a great reminder in a culture where speed is everything, there needs to be a community that knows how to slow down. So it was helpful to make that distinction and then tie it to our work, at least in my own head. So thanks.
I like that. So I know in the interest of time, because I think that with this basis, the conversation that you all are going to have and the questions that you're going to ask are going to be so valuable, especially given that little hint of the conversation we just had. So I'm going to try to go through these very quickly, and feel free to just hop in, and I think I have the chat open now, so I should be able to see, but feel free to also just jump in with questions or comments, but because I'm going to go pretty fast. So the next few slides are these resume studies, and what this is meant to do is kind of just solidify that yes, this exists. And it could be that for you all, you realize or you see this and you say, yeah, I get it. I can see that this happens and this exists, but it could also feel like, no, this doesn't happen. I don't want it to happen, so I'm not going to believe that it does. So these slides are meant to kind of say, yes, this happens, right? Here's some proof of what occurs in our world. And so in the US, this was a resume study that was done, I believe, in Chicago to kind of the communications and broadcasting industry. And thousands of resumes were sent out. And the resumes were exactly the same in the first stage. So most resume studies, the resumes are exactly the same, and you change the name on it to see what happens. So in these, they gave some of the resumes very historically African American names, and some more historically and generic Caucasian names. And when they sent them out, there was a 50% higher response rate for the historically white names than the African American names. Exact same resume. So then the researchers said, well, let's see if we give one set a better resume. If we give them better experience and we give them better credentials, what happens? Well, they tried them with both groups. When they gave it to the African American, there was a small bump. There was a 9% increase with the better resume. Then they did it with the Caucasian names, and they got a 30% better response rate. Exact same increase in what the resume said, but there was a better response made for those names. What they determined with their calculations is that having a more white name gave you 8 years of experience. So this is a real life example. It's not a research study, but there was a gentleman in Southern California whose name was Jose, and he was just diligently searching for a job. He sent out hundreds of resumes. He was looking for a job very intently, and he wasn't getting any responses. It had been months and months, and he was just searching and searching. So he decided he would use his same last name, but he would go by Joe instead of Jose. And he received many responses in the first week. And his quote was that he had to drop that S to get a title. Yeah. And this is a study, and I have studies, they've done these resume studies all over the world. So there's mostly in Europe, but there's a few in Asia as well. But most of this research has been done at universities in the US and in Europe. So this study was done to think about those religious stereotypes. So in this one, these pictures are actually put on, they're representative. I pulled these pictures from Google, but in Europe, they actually use pictures. It's a common practice on their CVs, on their resumes. So and that adds a whole nother dimension of the ability to use your fast brain, right? If you have a picture on there. So I put these pictures on there. But what this shows is a very stereotypical Muslim name and a very historically Christian name on one side. And again, it shows the response rates and how much more the Christian name received in pay. So it shows a monetary impact to this. Oh, and it sounds like we have some input that people have seen this happening before in the comments. And this example, I think is kind of, a sad way, funny, right, in an ironic way, because when all this research is happening, the science and math departments say, oh yeah, I know people have biases, they use them, but not us. right? That's what we always want to say. Not us, right? Not us because we're better people, or not us because I study this and I read all these articles all the time. There's no way I have these biases. So the science group, they decided, okay, we'll do this for Yale and Harvard. And we're going to send it out just to the science departments and see what happens. So exact same resume. They said, can you rate the resumes, say how much you would pay them, and who you like, how you can rate them on a likability scale, and also say if you would like to mentor them. So you can see on the slide the results, right? So exact same resume. The man was rated higher, was going to make more money, he was more likely to be hired, and mentored. So if you think about that, who do you think is going to become a leader? If they are hired, obviously, right? But if they're also mentored by leaders. So it's something to think about, right? And we'll talk about, if we get there, some likability penalties that occur for women and minorities. And that's, I think, probably what's happening for poor Jennifer over here. She's seen as very likable, but probably not competent. So we've talked a lot about that bias exists, right? It's there, we don't like it, but it's our fast brains applying things that, yes, help us be safe, but we're applying it to people, and people are very complex, right? We're not lions that are coming to eat us. We need to think more slowly about how we judge people. So one thing that exists is this higher bar in unconscious bias, that we're using different signals, all these things and more that I have mentioned here, to make a judgment on somebody. So one example is a law associate. And this was similar to a resume study, but it was a writing sample from a law associate that was given to people. And on one, they said that the background, his ethnic background was African American. On one, they said he was Caucasian. And on the Caucasian one, they found less errors and had less comments. They said, oh, great potential. And on the other one, oh, they found so many errors, spelling errors, said, oh, this person needs to work on their writing. So what this means is that there's this higher bar for people that don't fit the stereotype. If you fit the stereotype, it's easier to glide through that. If you don't fit it, people are more critical. They're trying to find those errors. So in the interest of time, I think I've seen a few up here. If anybody wants to comment, I'll open it up for people to comment. If not, we can keep going, but I'm totally open to stop. We'll give it a second.
Christy and Shannon, I think your comments would be interesting for us to hear.
I'll let Shannon. She's.
Yeah, just thinking about, you made a comment, Rebecca, about titles matter, and especially for women. And I think that that's an interesting concept for me that's really new, in that I've heard a lot of men say things like titles don't really matter, we share power, you know, we whatever, call yourself whatever you want. And I think that it makes a difference maybe for women more than it does for men. And so that was an interesting comment. And then I think what Krista was saying as well is like a lot of women get to the table, but don't necessarily really get a voice when they get there. And so I think a lot of the bias that you're talking about still plays out when women get to the table. And where does the power actually lie? Do the elders have the power, or is the pastor really the final say? Like, I just, a lot of those dynamics would be interesting to dig in.
Mm-hmm. And in my context, I've heard that a lot as well. Like, oh, well, titles don't matter. And I know that they lead our organization. And there's lots of problems with that. One is that when somebody doesn't have the title, they can't really be a role model for others. And role modeling, when we start to talk about changes, is one of the biggest mechanisms for change. So Lena, right, being in a leadership position makes a difference to who's coming up the pipeline after her to say, hey, that's possible, right? And so if we use my example of the admin assistant who really does the job of a VP, does that give younger women the possibility to say, hey, I can be a VP, or can they just be an admin that does the VP's job, right? And so even though I say that example and really they're doing almost all of the job, do they sit down with the board of the directors, right? So for yours, it would be, you know, with different groups and with the pastor, right? And to see where the decisions are being made. So if all the work's being done, then who's really making the decision, right? And those titles do make a difference there. And I sometimes kind of laugh to myself, and I have to think about a politically correct way to say that the people who are saying that are usually the people in power with the title. Like, it doesn't matter, we all share it. Like, okay, well, let's switch titles then. Right? So it doesn't always. I think women say that a lot now too. Oh, I'm not in it for the money. When we're talking about people who are making $1 million a year, right? And somebody else is making 60, right? Oh, I'm not in it for the money. I just love helping this VP. I'm like, okay, well, that's just crappy, right? So we need to think about that equity, right? And it does make a difference in the power and who holds that decision making.
Any other comments or questions for Rebecca? Okay.
So we're getting into these, how do we change, right? What are the things we can do? And we're not going to get in it too much today. I'm going to go through a couple of examples pretty quickly, because today was really about setting this basis and starting to think about how our brains work, what we can do in your specific organization to change this. So I'll just go through a couple of them, and we can always do another session that deep dives into different techniques on how you can change this, and maybe more applicable to what you all are doing. But one of the ways that's so easy and is proven with research to make a difference, right? So I love these ones that show me positive change. So in this case, they had 2 resumes, one almost identical, but one had more experience and the other one had more education. And one was a woman. They put woman's name on one and a man's name on the other. And when they showed it to the group, the council that was deciding, they said, oh, we want more education. Oh, that was the man's name. Then they showed them it again. They had switched the names, and they said, oh, education is so much more important. And that was the man's name again, because they had switched them. Then they said, okay, what right now, before we look at any candidates, tell me what is important in this role. What do we need? And they said, we have to have more education for X, Y, Z. And so they said, okay, that is the most important thing in this role, education. Everyone said, yes, education is the most important. So they showed them the resumes. They picked the education when the man's name was on it, and they picked education when the woman's name was on it. What that meant is that our brains weren't allowed to shift the criteria to what we pictured in this role. And so this role, as we can see from the pictures, was a chief of police role. So before, when we didn't have the criteria set, we tricked ourselves. We said, I have a criteria. I picked the man because we needed more education. Oh, I picked the man because we needed more experience. If you had said to that person, could a woman be in this role? They would have said, sure, but we needed more experience, or we needed more education. So we actually trick ourselves to align our decisions with our stereotypes. But, even though that's very depressing, but we can stop that by deciding what the criteria is in advance. So I think that is critical. As I hear you all talk, so I've only had a glimpse into it, but I could see something like this being helpful at all levels, right? To say, what is the actual criteria? What are the skills we need in this role? And not think about all the other background, not allow the fast brain to come in. Ooh, and I like everybody's starting to think about how this works for your organization, which I love. That's the idea. So I'm going to go through this one really quickly. Lena kind of introduced this wonderfully at the beginning with her religious and theological viewpoint on this. So, and it completely aligns with what I see every day doing this work. One of the biggest biggest impacts on people's success are the language that's used to describe them. And there is an unconscious prototype or stereotype of leadership. And this is a kind of made up term because we don't want to call it masculine, because masculine doesn't need to be, male doesn't need to be this. So they've come up with a term called agentic. So agentic language is this powerful, strategic, aggressive, all those types of words, risk taker, that are thought of as a leader. And they've done these studies that says that when they asked people, so what they did is kind of ask a random sampling of people. They said, what do you describe as a leader? What do you describe as a male? What do you describe as a female? And what they see in that is that there's a 71% overlap for what you describe as a male and what you describe as a leader. So it's much easier for a man to fit into the box of a leader, right? The picture of a leader. Only 10% overlap with what people see as female traits and leadership, right? So that just a smaller overlap, which again makes it harder for you to see a woman in that leadership role. And if we think about we think about them as more feminine, right? Because they overlap with women more, but we're not going to call them female because they are definitely characteristics that men have. And this is just as detrimental for men as it is for women. It doesn't affect their success, but it affects their personal and internal angst, right? For men that are more collaborative, we call this communal, right? It's that team building. And for me, in organizations, I see a lot of organizations say that this is very important. But then when they're making decisions on who should become a leader in the organization, these are lower level. And the ones that really matter are these other ones right here, to being successful in when you're graded, when you're given a promotion. And these same things go for different ethnicities as well, right? Most of this research has been done primarily for gender because it's an easier variable to play with, right? It's male, female, there's only 2 variables rather than race and ethnicity. But we also see this go across white, non-white. We see it for LGBTQ, straight. We see this across lots of diversity dimensions. We also see it for introverts and extroverts, right? So really thinking about the language you use, and I can provide a handout at the end as well that kind of gives you an idea of this, thinking about what words to use and being deliberate, right? The slow brain, not the fast brain. And again, I fall victim to this. I was giving accolades to one of my team members, one of my employees, and I was talking about what a good team player she was, which she was. But she drove an initiative. She created an entire presentation, gave almost all of it, and I gave a little section at the end. And I'm like, oh, she's such a wonderful team player. No, I should have used words like, she drove this. She created X amount of revenue. She led us to success. Instead, I almost wrote, oh, she's a wonderful team player. Which one's more impactful? Which one do you want to hire on your next job? Nah, the team player sounds great, but she's probably going to be kind of a low-level associate, not a leader, right? So my word choices, giving somebody accolades can make a difference in their future. I'm going to skip through these just kind of very, very briefly because I know we only have 6 minutes. I touched on this earlier about men and women and different ethnicities. Women are seen as likable, but not competent. And a lot of times women get feedback that says, toot your own horn. But if you toot your own horn, you are seen as competent and say, oh, she's good, but she's not fun to work with, or she's not likable, right? And that's a hard line. And you hear this from a lot of women in leadership positions, that they're always having to tiptoe over this line. And I've talked to a lot of people that say, that takes so much brain power. You're not thinking about the task at hand. You're not thinking about making a community better and improving everyone's lives. Instead, you're thinking, okay, I can't say that because I won't be likable. I have to, okay, how do I say it so that people are receptive to me? Whereas somebody else might just be able to say it and brainstorm instead of having to think about, what does this mean? How should I say it? What are people going to think? And again, this likability penalty goes across all different dimensions of diversity. So lastly, and I think this is the last slide I'll go through. So one of the ways that we can combat this is to say, we're not going to go with our first choice, our only choice, and say, oh, we interviewed this man, we looked at him, oh, he's in our network, he's amazing, let's just do it. Instead, if we make a deliberate choice to say, we're going to make sure that no matter what role we're doing, or in these certain level of roles or whatever it is, we are going to make sure that we always include in our conversations at least one woman. And two would actually be better because it helps our brains break those stereotypes. It's one of these weird brain things again, right? If we only have one, it's so much easier to slide them over into the stereotypical category. Instead of if there's two, it's much easier to say, oh, it's broken my mold. There's two now. The category and the stereotype, might not be true. It helps us switch to the slow brain. But even one, the chances then that you actually put them in the role increase so significantly. So this is a study from the NFL that said, oh my goodness, why do we not have these head coaches, African-American head coaches? When we think about how diverse the teams are, how are there not African-American coaches? Let's make a change. And they increased so significantly in a pretty short time frame. We have seen progress stall in this, and I actually, in a way, I like this piece because it shows you can't just do one piece of it. You also have to help the pipeline, right? You have to do both. So this is a complex issue, and it has pieces all over the place. So you can't just say, oh, we're going to just make sure we have people with diverse slates. We also have to make sure there's people all the way through to get up to that diverse slate. Okay. So I'm just going to stop real quick. We have only 3 minutes left. I'll transfer it over to Lena, but I want to leave you all with thinking about this content and thinking about what you already are doing. What can you do, right? You're thinking about that this exists, maybe feeling disheartened, but what can you do tomorrow, today, to start to make a change in the decisions you're making, right? Or even in the conversations you're having. So that's what I'd like to leave you with. And Lena, I will pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for all of that really great information. And I think for a lot of us, some of it was new. For some of us, I mean, I was over here amening much of what you were presenting to us, but I think it's given us a lot of good things to think about in terms of how we integrate and, actually to Chris's point earlier, practice what we already believe about some things in terms of the way that other ways that we are doing our work that can be applied to the today's presentation. So thank you. I'm going to ask if folks can just give us some grace and give us, we had a little bit of a late start because of the technology piece. And so I'm going to see and just ask folks if you can give us some time on the end of this so that we can get through some comments and questions. And then also we have some things that we want to present to you all in terms of what the organization in terms of the leadership is putting in place around helping us get to some of this question about equity. Are there any comments or questions that we want to track now that we can, I think it would be helpful for me and Chris if there are questions that you all have that can be thrown into the mix around the Peacemaker Fellowship that you want us to capture related to this presentation today. That would be good to know.
Hello.
Oh, I can't. Who is that's talking? I can't hear you. Joel, you're maybe others can hear you, but I can't. No. Can anybody else hear Joel? Okay.
No.
Okay. Sorry, Joel. I don't know if you can hear me, but for some reason we're having a hard time getting your sound. Can you write it in the chat box? Okay. Any other comments or questions? Thanks, Joel. Okay, if not, I'm going to turn it over to Chris here to just share a little bit with you some of the ways that he and the staff and board have been looking at this question.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to share my screen, and this will just be a minute. I wanted to show what we're working on in terms of how this lands. Can you all see my screen? It should say Street Psalms Board Tool.
Yeah.
You see that? Okay. So Rebecca, that was wonderful and uncomfortable to because the reality is, we suffer from these biases within our network and have for a long, long time. My guess is that we didn't arrive at these biases overnight, and we probably won't get out of them overnight. And that's frustrating for all of us, because I think we all want to get to a new place, but you're helping us do the long, hard work that I think is necessary. But one of the ways this lands, so this doesn't just kind of become a good intentioned thing. We've got to figure out a way how this lands structurally. And this gets at, I think, your comment around setting criteria out of the gate. And so there's 3 ways that we are trying to set criteria as an organization to address this question of diversity, specifically around gender equity. And the 3 areas are, one, around the board, which is a board tool that I'm going to show you here briefly. The second is around hub directors themselves. We've created a matrix for hub directors that set criteria for new hub directors that we're hoping to bring on. And then thirdly, for senior fellows, we're in this early stages of setting criteria for senior fellows going forward. And I don't want to go into detail, but I do want to say that if this conversation doesn't land structurally within the organization, it will remain a good intention and we'll just not get where we want to go. So just as an example, here is the board. And you can see where it says characteristics there at the top. Actually, a better word might be criteria. And I think you're helping us name what that criteria might be. But right now, what we've looked at our board and said, hey, we know we want to reflect the demographic diversity of the network. And you can see right out of the gate, it's male, female, white, person of color, domestic perspective, international perspective. And then we know we want to represent the geographical mix on the board of our network. And you can see, we've identified Puget Sound and other. And then, of course, we want to represent the skills that are necessary to make this all work. You can see that. And then denominational affiliation. We're heavily Protestant, a few Catholics thrown into the mix. Go Catholics. But what we're trying to do is set criteria. And this is by no means a complete document. But what I wanted to do here is just share with the network how this conversation is going to land structurally. And we're doing the same thing for, as I said, new hub development, so that new hubs, we will make a criteria coming on that new hubs, we're looking for hub directors who are women in leadership to lead those hubs. And the same thing is true for senior fellows. And I won't go through again those right now, but I do want to just call that up and say what we're looking at is setting criteria at the structural level of the organization so that power is shared in an equitable way throughout the network. So that's a little bit of where we're going in the next 6-8 months with our Urban Peacemaker Fellowship. And you all are obviously going to give input along the way to help us set that criteria going forward. So thank you again. That was just, it was really, really helpful. I think a number of folks asked when we can get you back and finish out the rest of the slides. Just having this kind of information is just so useful. So thank you. Lena?
Yeah, I just want to open up this conversation, not today, but as we're kind of developing the criteria, the global context for this conversation. I'm not sure that we have all of the quote unquote criteria that, I mean, I know criteria is super important, but is the criteria still looking at, is it still through a lens that doesn't fully represent, the breadth of the places where we work, right? And so, I mean, I'm not sure we would need help from folks who are not in this context, but what is criteria that makes sense for street psalms, right? Because I think the criteria that is in place that we put here looks like the criteria that maybe other organizations use. And I'm just wondering, and I don't have the answer to this, but I'm just wondering if there's something that's even more innovative in how we look at the diversity equitable lens. The other question that we have to, and I think this will happen as we're unpacking this slowly, trying to use the slow brain a little bit, is, what are the nuances that that we can learn from and listen to, in a context where, this conversation will go slow, right, in some ways. On the other hand, I would say, applying a little bit of our theology here, that I am certain that there are already, in terms of the pipeline question, I think there are probably women in our pipelines that are in places that, what does this look like in that context where it's not going to be this easy thing that you can count and see readily. So.
And I just want to clarify as well. So I think when you're thinking about criteria, you have a start to it on that, but thinking about it more in depth of when you're looking for somebody in each of these roles, what are you looking for as far as the skill set? So you have it started there, but be really specific, again, because otherwise you can shift that criteria. So thinking about, is it 10 years of experience in X? Is it, leading a group of X amount of people? Is it having global experience, right? As specific as you can be, and then even prioritizing those, because again, our brains will shift the criteria to what we see that fitting, right? So you could even say, if you have a list of 10 things, that's a lot of things to be able to shift your brain around. If you have, in the example I gave with the police chief, right, it was education or experience, right? It was much easier because it was one or the other was the only variable. In a real life circumstance, you have a list of hopefully less than 10, and you should try to get it down to what are those 10, or maybe even 5 or 3, and then even prioritize them, because then you can say, is it leadership? Is that what we want? And then if that's what it is, it might be easier to say, this woman has that. So what if she didn't go through the normal path that we would normally put on here? She has what we ultimately need, and not the typical path that we see to get to your roles, because the typical path is not resulting in what you want, right? Is that gender diversity. So maybe you need to think of what are the actual skill sets, not the path that it takes to get there.
That's good.
I think that is really good, because I think that diving a little bit deeper will help us, because I think intuitively we sort of we could probably name some of this stuff and with a different kind of lens, which I think we are constantly doing in our work, is analyzing our lens of ministry. And I think that what you just named, Rebecca, will help us open this up a little bit. Okay, so being sensitive. Is there another comment? Just want to go around. Nick, anything?
No, excuse me, not at this point. I mean, I think that what Rebecca just said was kind of what I was feeling, is that we need to focus on the criteria. I think that the outward appearance and the geography and stuff like that is important for what we do, but also deciding what skill set are we looking for in the hub director, because I think we rely very heavily on our relational networks, which is absolutely what this is about. And I also think we need to balance that with some of the criteria that we come up with.
Christy? You're muted.
Barbara.
You're still on mute, Christy.
How do you interpret? Somebody interpret what she might be saying.
I can tell she can hear us.
Let me come back to you, Christy. Salem, anybody?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Do I have to?
No, you're good.
You're good.
Well, thinking of criteria, what keeps going through my mind is some of the problems with the inclusion piece is tradition and figuring out how to be non-traditional, and especially in a context where women are the ones that are taking care of the children. So I think that I'm thinking of like broad and long term and all that, but what can we do that's not, maybe it's not going to be traditional to be inclusive. And that's loaded, but that's what keeps going through my mind. Thinking of Christy is sitting with her daughter, Evelyn, which I think is a non-traditional picture right there. So that's kind of what's going through my mind.
Awesome.
And I thought that as well. I was like, that is how, even in corporations, right, you can't do the traditional, because if you do what always was done, then you're not creating change, right? You're doing the status quo inherently, right? So having flexible work models, right? Making sure that you're thinking about the fact that, yes, even though the workplace or the home life is becoming more and more equitable as the workplace does, still women take on 80% of home responsibilities. So thinking about, is there the room to leave at 3, right? Or making trips shorter, right? Things like that enable women to do both of those things, since that's the way the world works. We can't change it overnight. We can't say, oh yeah, men and women are going to do half at home and take care of the kids. That's not the way it works, right? So how can we make this work and still get women there? Because that's how those things start to change.
Salem?
Here in Salem, what's sticking with me is that when I look around, the social service sector has had success in our area at really letting women rise to the top and take leadership and have voice at the table. So I'm wondering what their criteria looks like. So going and looking deeper at the questions they're asking that the church isn't asking.
Awesome. Thanks, DJ. Shannon?
Yes. So thinking about how are you not just like tokenizing women and saying like we need a quota of 2 because Rebecca said don't have just 1. So I think that's the heart of what she was getting at by looking at the skill set. But and so I think the conversation is good, but also how is there some accountability throughout the network that leaders are having these conversations, that they're changing these practices, that they are, someone mentioned like not everybody's on the call, not everyone's hearing this conversation. And so how does it become something that is like mandatory that you're thinking through this at minimum,
Joel?
Yeah. I sent you a message, but I can share. One of the things that it came to mind as I was listening to all of this is how do we frame the contextuality of this issue, and how do we open the space to create a better pipeline that it's contextually sensitive. I come and I live in a very macho-driven culture, and Lena asked me through message, what are your thoughts on that? What are you doing right now? I don't know what my thoughts are specifically, but what am I doing right now is the specifics of rewiring my brain, even to the point of start meeting with some of these women. You know, I live in a context where people see me having a cup of coffee with one of my female friends, immediately starts, oh my goodness, Joel's cheating on Annette, oh, what are his intentions? And even the rewiring of how I see my colleagues in such an intense macho environment. But that's very specific to Guatemala. So yeah, I think part of it's breaking my own fear, in the contextuality of the issue. But yeah, we might need some help there too.
And Joel, I would actually say, that's something that you might think in Guatemala, you might think about it in a religious context, but it's actually something that these corporations are dealing with, and these corporate leaders, because of a very unique place in history we are right now. So all of the sexual harassment scandals in the U.S., the Harvey Weinstein world, this Me Too movement, right? There's all these aspects that are making it hard for very well-intentioned male leaders to make this change. So it is something that is very universal right now, unfortunately, right? So that is something that it wouldn't be just you, right? That's something that many people are dealing with. And how do they strike that balance? Because there is a legitimate fear. So what do you do? And I don't think I have the answers to that, but it's something that we all can work through globally, right? Of how we start to change that. But I wanted you to know that that's something that, it's across industries, it's across the world, right? Across countries is something that people are dealing with.
Then one last thing is, how do, the question that came up to my mind is, how do we actually make community with females, not include females in our community? Because those are two totally different approaches. I can include somebody, but that's still, I don't remember who was it. I think it was Shannon or Christy who talked about the power differential. If I include somebody, it's still my right to include somebody. But if I make community with, then it's an option for everybody, it does not fall on one person.
Thank you. Thanks. Christy Farber.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I'm trying to think I have about 100 things. I don't know which one to really think through, but one that I just was processing while Joel was talking about is, are we ready for this down the line? So when we do bring women in, and living in a church right now that is for the first time hired and has 2 female pastors, I see the response from a culture that is not as machismo, but still has some pushback from that in really subtle and hard ways that people have had to try to figure out how to deal with. You could avoid it. Some of the congregation could avoid it, but it's real. And so it's inviting people into a world they haven't been in. How do we then invite the people in and then support them into this leadership role? So on some level, it's like, how do we help communities see this new leadership role? And then how do we make sure that how are we supporting the women and how they feel once they get in there and the responses that come? And so that's what I don't even know how to frame that well, I don't think, but I don't know. And I don't want to say that I understand every cultural context in which that will come, but I just want to be aware that there are questions there I don't know how to answer.
And by the way, for those who don't know, Christy's on our board and been a long time friend of myself and Lana and Street Psalms. So we go back, I don't know, 15 years? Yeah, something like that. So thanks for being a part of this. Sorry, go ahead, Lena.
Christy Humphreys.
something that I was asking Rebecca in like my chat was just a thought that I had was we're so conditioned by our society to not see women in leadership roles. I think sometimes it's hard for women to see themselves in leadership roles. Like, oh, I could never do that job, right? Like I have a bias against myself. And I'd be interested to think about how we can help women overcome the biases in themselves. That's my thought.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Michael, South Africa. You're muted.
Yeah, for me, the thing that I'm struck with is this seemingly small percentage of 1% all of a sudden plays into structural dynamics that multiply. And I'm just looking at, the formation of the Urban Training Collaborative, the Senior Fellows Initiative, and whether we like it or not, they've been moved and shaped and influenced by unconscious bias. And so I'm wondering now, what are the implications of that? For example, if we had set our criteria, and I thought we went through this in a slow way, but if we set our criteria up front and then started to place people through a process of discernment, how would we look different? And so it's not tokenism, but it's actually that sense of a community that we've worked through this in such. So now we're working at it, and I think that's right. But what does that mean for some of us that might not or should not be at the table because that bias has already worked into the structure?
Thank you. Mario?
Yeah, thank you. While I'm sitting here and listening to the conversation, I remember that in the last 2 months, I've participated in many different conversations around this issue. We have this discussion at other networks I'm a part of. In our context, the Dominican Republic is also it's a macho culture, macho-driven culture. But we have a phenomenon that we have many women, for example, in my communities, the church, the education world, schools, private and public, and even in other corporate organizations, we have the participation of many women. We have more women graduating from high school and from college in the Dominican Republic, but still we have the differences in terms of the top positions are occupied by men. And where we see more impact of the unjust relationship between men and women is in the family system. I would say, more women participate in the workforce and in other areas of society. It's causing that many men feel like, being displaced. They're being displaced, and women are suffering a lot of violence. For example, we have close to 200 women that are killed every year in the Dominican Republic by their husband, or boyfriends. As a response to women becoming more involved in every aspect of life and society. So I believe we have a lot of work to do in education, educating early on, especially with children, so that this culture of discrimination of men against women changes. But it's going to take a long time before we see, some positive changes in that direction.
Yeah.
So the fact that we're having a conversation in our network, in other networks, in the church, in the education system, and even in the political arena, it's a good beginning, and I'm very hopeful, even though it will take, the change is very, very slow, too slow.
Yep.
So what I'm trying to say is that inclusion is not necessarily a guarantee that, our mindset towards women equality or any other groups that are discriminated will change how we function.
Thank you, Mario. Anchorage.
I feel like I had enough to say in the chat box, so I'll just.
Thanks. Tim Merrill.
Yeah. These are, I don't know about other minority groups, but these are always interesting conversations for African Americans. And generally, we leave diversity and inclusion sessions and go to lunch and tell our horror stories and our jokes about the concept. And as an example, the United Methodist Church keeps on bugging me about going into the pastoral process because they say they have an issue with diversity and they lack African American leadership. But when I look at the African American at the United Methodist Church, my question is always, why in the world would any black man with a common sense or black woman with common sense be a part of what you're doing? Because it's rigged. It's been rigged against us. And so now what you're asking me to do is to fit into a system that has already been rigged against me. So in their case, they look at a criteria for me being involved in their process, but they haven't looked at the criteria for them attracting someone like me to the process. And so I think a step in what we need to do is look at, ask the hard questions about why women aren't already involved in what we do. And then ask questions about, well, how attractive is what we do? How's this going to attract women? Is it going to attract women, or is it part of a rigged system, which is just part and parcel of any power dynamic in the West? So I think we've got some tough questions to ask around those issues, because what I don't want to do is what we see happening all the time is have a structure where we're trying to fit people into a structure that just really does not work for them, and then we decry our lack of diversity. Usually lack of diversity happens for several reasons, and that's one of the reasons, is that it's just not structured and suited for the people that we say that we lack. So I think this is a good start, but I think we've got to ask ourselves some serious questions about that, because, from my perspective, these conversations always go on, but it's rare that we get to these issues of, well, why would Tim want to be a part of this? So I'd love to see us at some point start messing with some of that stuff.
Thanks, Tim. Joel Van Dyke.
All right, I don't know if you can hear me. I've been getting every third word for about the last hour or so. Internet problems, but I'll try to talk. If you don't hear me, Lena, then just wave your hand and I'll shut up. But yeah, I think what I'm aware and present to a lot of stuff from this, and I made a little joke about, can we all get on this call again tomorrow in the chat, just because it is, I just think it's so generative, the conversation, and helpful on multiple levels. I think in one ways, if I had to summarize it to what's my core thought right now, out of all of them, is I'm coming back to our leadership definition that we've been utilizing in our training from Robert Terry. This idea that leadership is the courage to call forth authentic action in the commons. And I'm trying to put that into perspective to a conversation like this. The idea of leadership having the courage to call forth that which is latent in others, that which is in existence. Having the courage to name it and really lift it up. And I think I'm aware of that largely as I think about our last conversation and our smaller group around this, where I made a comment, Lena, that you jumped on me for, that was so helpful for me. And I don't know if I've actually ever told you that, but it was around this issue. It was saying, as I've been training in Central America and been with all these cohorts of leaders, it's clear that the majority of participants in those trainings are women, both numerically oftentimes, but also in efficiency or effective ministry being done. It's actually those who are in the conversations in those contexts. In many cases, it's the woman's voice that is so prominent, and the work in the hardest communities is being done by women. But it remains that, and I think I made the comment that the women don't want to take the facilitative leadership of a thing like a hub or mobilizing others in particular cities. They haven't wanted to do that, and so they're very fine within the context to allow men to have those facilitative roles. And you confronted me, and it was so helpful to say, well, you never wanted that. That's not something you grew up with wanting, but you saw it as being called forth out of you, and you moved into and stepped into that role in a very generative way. And partly is some of the things that Rebecca was sharing around the stereotypes, the prejudices that we bring into these conversations are things like that, that we make assumptions based on observations in front of us, and there's a lack of courage to call forth that which is actually present. And so I'm struggling with what that looks like and how that courage can be manifested in a network like ours, in a community of practice that wants to live courageously. And we're engaging this particular issue as one that I believe is seeking to call forth that courage from us in a generative way. So it's a disorientating process, but one I think is extremely helpful. And I've appreciated the honesty and vulnerability of the conversations to date that has brought us to this point. I hope you heard that, because my internet just seems so weak.
I did. We did. Well, I think I've gone around. I hope I didn't miss anybody. Rebecca, thank you so much. I think you can see, thanks y'all for staying on the conversation. I know we're over a bit. I know that people, that we're taking this very seriously, and there's lots of good thinking and good questions for us, like hard questions for us to consider, that I think will help us to continue to take the small, slow brain approach to this. So unless there's anything else, Chris, I think we're good.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to just pray for all of us, and then we are going to say goodbye. So, Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for just what we've heard. Thank you for Rebecca. Thank you for the gifts that she has brought to our conversation and to our community in this fellowship. Lord, I pray that you would just be with us as we are in this conversation. Help us to slow down, to look hard at the things that you've put in front of us, so that we can actually do the work that you've called us to do in ways that are transformative for our communities and also for each of us. We thank you, and we just go now in your presence. Amen.